The cold fluorescent lights of St. Helena's Hospital flickered once as the night shift prepared to give in to dawn. In the nearly empty hallway, Nurse Elena Rahman tugged the straps of her worn satchel over her shoulder, exhausted enough that the edges of the world felt soft and unreal. Her 12-hour shift had bled into 13, then 14, each patient needing something at the exact moment she thought she could finally leave. Now, at the threshold of escape, she could feel the ache behind her ribs, pulsing like a second heartbeat. But the hallway wasn't silent. It never was when trouble was coming. A cluster of voices drifted from near the entrance, sharp, unfamiliar, carrying an electricity that made the security guard straighten in his seat. Elena paused, sensing tension before she saw its source. She had spent years reading unspoken danger in intensive care rooms in the silence of a monitor just before it screamed. Something in the air now felt the same, tight, anticipatory, bracing for impact. She turned toward the glass doors just as they slid open. 3 men stepped inside, moving with a synchronized stillness that didn't come from practice alone. It came from survival. Their boots hit the floor in deliberate, measured rhythm, and the damp gray of dawn clung to their uniforms. No insignia gave away their identity, yet everything about the way they carried themselves announced it anyway. Military, elite, accustomed to shadows and storms. Their faces were unshaven, jawlines set in granite, eyes scanning with a depth that made people instinctively shift out of their path. The receptionist rose halfway, startled. Can I help?" The tallest of them ignored the question. His gaze had already locked onto Elena. In that moment, something hot and cold moved through her entire body at once. Not because she recognized them, she didn't, but because their attention felt intentional, direct, as if her presence wasn't just noticed, but required. And then something happened that made the guard sit up straight, made the receptionist's breath catch, and made Elena forget the weight of her own exhaustion. The 3 men approached her in perfect formation, stopping a deliberate distance away, as though observing a protocol no one else could see. The tall one spoke first, his voice low but carrying through the hall with unnerving clarity. "Ma'am," he said, with the kind of respect usually reserved for decorated officers, not nurses finishing graveyard shifts. The words struck the space around her like a physical force. Elena blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. No one had ever called her that with such gravity. It wasn't an honorific, it was recognition. A passing orderly slowed, watching the moment unfold with growing confusion. Elena felt heat rise to her face. She wasn't the type to like being singled out, let alone by strangers who looked like they'd walked straight out of some classified operation. I think you have the wrong person," she whispered, clutching the strap of her bag, but the men didn't waver. Behind their hardened expressions, something unspoken moved. Urgency, gratitude, and an emotional weight none of them seemed trained to hide. The leader took a step closer, lowering his voice. "No, ma'am, we're certain. We're here because of you." Her breath caught. Because of her? She searched their faces for clues, anything to anchor this surreal moment, but found only sincerity carved into exhaustion. These were men who didn't waste words, and yet they had crossed a city at dawn to find her. Something inside her stirred a memory she had buried deep. A night weeks ago, when a patient with no name and no past had been wheeled into her care with injuries that didn't match any ordinary fight. A patient she had protected, a patient someone dangerous had been searching for. Elena felt the hallway shrink around her as the leader's words settled like falling ash. "We're here because of you." She swallowed hard, her throat tightening with confusion she couldn't mask. For months her days had been spent stitching wounds, calming panicked families, and holding the hands of patients whose names she never learned. She was a nurse, not someone who summoned military ghosts to hospital doors at sunrise. But the way the 3 men stood before her still as stone, eyes locked on hers, made her wonder if she had brushed against something huge without ever realizing it. What is this about?" she asked, voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. The tallest man glanced toward the entrance as if scanning for invisible threats, then shifted his posture in a way that suggested he was fighting the urge to bow his head. "A man you treated 3 weeks ago," he said, "brought in under an alias, gunshot wound to the abdomen, broken ribs. He was barely conscious." A chill ran down her spine. She remembered him immediately, a stranger whose injuries told a story far darker than any she had the right to ask about. He had arrived at the hospital alone, half conscious, refusing to give any real information. There had been something haunted behind his eyes, something that made her feel as if he hadn't just been wounded. He had been hunted. She had tended to him without questions, guided only by instinct and the quiet sense that asking too much would put him in danger. She remembered the tension in his muscles, the way he clenched his jaw as if protecting secrets heavier than his own survival. And she remembered one more thing, something she'd told no one. When 2 men in plain clothes had come asking suspicious questions about him, she had lied. Calmly, convincingly, without hesitation. She had said the patient died during surgery, listed him as John Doe, and removed his room number from the internal system for 24 hours until he stabilized. Something in her soul demanded she protect him, though she didn't understand why. Now, as the 3 strangers before her stood waiting, she felt that long, buried instinct rise again. The second man, broader in the shoulders and wearing faint scars across his knuckles, spoke with a voice that carried restrained relief. "Ma'am, that man, he's one of ours." She froze, her bag slipping slightly down her arm. A Navy SEAL. The revelation hit her like a cracking branch in a silent forest, sudden, sharp, impossible to ignore. The stranger she had nursed through fever, blood loss, and nightmares wasn't some runaway criminal or reckless fighter. He was a decorated operative who had survived battles the world would never hear about. The third SEAL, younger but with eyes hardened by experience far beyond his age, added, "You didn't just treat him. You shielded him when others were looking. If those men had reached him that night, he wouldn't be alive today." Alina's chest tightened. She remembered that night as a blur of adrenaline, of shadows leaning too close to the nurse's station, of her own steady voice lying without a tremor. She had acted out of instinct, not out of any belief that the consequences could be life or death. "I didn't know who he was," she whispered. "You weren't supposed to," the leader said softly, "but you chose to protect him anyway." He stepped forward, and for the first time she noticed something unexpected: humility. A quiet gratitude laced through the fatigue on his face, as if he'd been carrying a weight he wasn't permitted to show until now. "Ma'am," he continued, "our brother said your name before he passed out again. Said if we ever made it back stateside, we were to find you, to tell you something he didn't think he'd survive to say himself." The air left her lungs. "Tell me what?" she asked. The man's voice grew steadier, anchored by a promise he was fulfilling. "That you saved more than his life. You saved part of a mission that prevented a greater threat. What you did, your choices, your courage, it rippled far beyond this hospital." A strange, weightless feeling spread through her chest, as if her body had suddenly forgotten how to hold everything that was being placed upon it. "I'm just a nurse," she murmured. The leader's voice deepened. Not to him. He reached into a secure pouch on his vest, withdrawing something small but heavy, looking, a metallic glint catching the dim hallway light. A coin, not ordinary, etched, worn, impossible to mistake. A SEAL challenge coin. He held it in both hands as if offering a sacred vow. For a long moment Alina couldn't move. The coin lay in the SEAL's gloved palm, small enough to fit between 2 fingers, yet it radiated a weight that felt impossibly large. She had seen military tokens before. Patients sometimes carried them, or families brought them in during end of life rituals. But this one was different. Its edges were dulled by years of wear, the emblem almost ghost-like from having been rubbed during moments of fear or resolve. It wasn't a keepsake, it was a survivor's anchor. The leader extended it toward her. This belonged to him, he said. He wanted you to have it. Alina hesitated. Accepting it felt like stepping into a story she had never asked to be part of, one carved out of battles fought in deserts, oceans, and the silent corners of the world where only ghosts kept watch. She reached out slowly, her fingertips brushing the metal. It was warm from his hand, unexpectedly human. The moment she took it, a rush of emotion hit her so sharply she inhaled. Memories of that night surged back, his fevered murmurs, the way he'd gripped her wrist with surprising strength, as if grounding himself against the darkness closing in. She hadn't understood his whispered words then. She had assumed they were fragments of nightmares. Now she wondered if they had been pieces of a mission, prayers, unfinished goodbyes. The younger SEAL stepped forward, his voice quieter, more fragile. He said you stayed with him. Even when he stopped breathing for those few seconds, you brought him back, twice. She blinked, stunned. I only did what any nurse would do. No, the second man said firmly, shaking his head. I've seen the footage. Most would have called for backup. You didn't. You acted faster than protocol. Without you, we would have been burying a brother. His words struck her harder than she expected. She had spent years patching up strangers, carrying their pain on her shoulders as quietly as she carried her shifts. But rarely, almost never, did anyone look her in the eye and acknowledge what those moments demanded of her spirit. She closed her fingers fully around the coin. Something inside her cracked open. A soft murmur rose among the staff gathering nearby, drawn by the unusual scene. No one spoke, but curiosity pulsed through the corridor. A nurse receiving the respect of special forces. It felt unreal, like watching a parallel world bleed into theirs. Then the leader did something even more impossible. He went down on one knee. The other two followed without hesitation. The sight of 3 Navy SEALs kneeling in a hospital hallway, kneeling for her, sent a tremor through the air. The receptionist's hand flew to her mouth. The guard rose halfway from his chair, disbelief washing across his face. Alina stepped back, heart pounding. Please don't do that. I'm not. You are, the leader said, lifting his gaze. You're the reason our brother lived long enough for extraction. You're the reason a classified operation wasn't compromised. You're the reason several hostages on the other side of the world got home. The world tilted. What? She breathed. He nodded slowly. His mission wasn't finished when he came here. The intel he carried encrypted inside a device embedded near his rib was retrieved only because he survived his injuries long enough for us to find him. That information prevented a coordinated attack overseas. Alina felt the hallway sway, the fluorescence blurring into faint halos. She gripped the strap of her bag to steady herself. She had known she saved a life. That alone had been enough. But this was something else. She had never imagined her decision to lie to strangers, her refusal to abandon a fading pulse, had cascaded across oceans. And because of you, the leader continued, families slept safely last night. The coin felt heavier, almost unbearable in her palm. She whispered, barely audible, I didn't know. You weren't meant to, he replied. But he wanted you to know this. If he didn't make it, if he fell during extraction, someone had to come back for you. Someone had to tell you that you mattered, that you were seen. Her eyes burned, vision shimmering. Behind them, the dawn was growing brighter, painting the glass doors in muted gold. And for the first time in her career, she felt the weight she'd been carrying for years begin to shift. Not because it disappeared, but because someone finally reached out and lifted part of it with their hands. Ma'am, the leader said softly, we don't kneel often. He paused, letting the meaning settle. But we kneel for the ones who save us. Alina stood frozen. the world around her dissolving until only the three kneeling men remained in her field of vision. Their presence solid, unyielding, forged from battles she would never witness, contrasted sharply with the fragile stillness of the hospital hallway. She had spent years walking these floors, unseen and exhausted, quietly gathering the broken pieces of strangers' lives and stitching them back together. Yet now, with her shift ending and her body begging for rest, the universe had chosen this moment to unfold a truth she wasn't prepared to hold. Slowly, she shook her head. "Please stand, people are watching, we know." The younger SEAL replied gently, rising first. "That's precisely why we're doing it. Most never see what people like you carry. Today, they will." The other two stood as well, but not before each placed a hand over his chest, a gesture more intimate than salute, less formal than protocol. It wasn't military, it was human, a vow made from gratitude, not duty. As they straightened, the leader regarded her with a depth that made her breath unsteady. "He lived," he said. "Your patient, our brother. He's undergoing recovery at a secure facility, but he insisted we come." Warm relief washed over her, so sudden it left her dizzy. "He's alive, because of you," the second man murmured. Elena's hand rose to her face, covering her mouth as emotions tangled inside her. Relief, disbelief, fear, wonder. For nights after treating him, she had woken to the echo of machines, the memory of his pulse fluttering beneath her fingertips like a terrified bird. She had wondered, silently and privately, if he had made it. She had pushed the thought away each time. Nurses weren't allowed to become attached not to patients, not to outcomes, not to the ghosts left behind when shifts ended. But she had, and now those ghosts had walked back to her in human form. "We're not here to disrupt your day," the leader continued, gentler now. "We're here to return something else he wanted you to have." He handed her a sealed envelope, thick, creased at the edges, the kind of envelope carried carefully, not casually. Her name was written across the front in handwriting she recognized instantly, even though she had never seen him write a single line. Inside, she sensed words meant for moments of truth, the kind that came when a man wasn't sure he'd survive long enough to speak them aloud. She stared at it, afraid to open it here, in front of strangers and fluorescent lights. "He said you'd probably read it later," the younger SEAL said with a softened smile. She nodded, clutching it to her chest. Her voice broke when she tried to speak. "I don't know how to thank you. You already did," the leader replied. "The night you refused to let him die." A long silence followed, quiet, but not empty, full, heavy, reverent. The three men stepped back in unison, preparing to leave, but before they reached the doors, the youngest paused and turned toward the small group of hospital staff who had gathered. "You all have no idea what she did," he said, loud enough for them to hear, "but we do." And with that, they walked out into the brightening morning. The doors slid shut behind them. The hallway remained utterly still, as though the building itself was holding its breath in awe. The guard slowly sank back into his seat, shaking his head. The receptionist blinked rapidly, unsure how to process what she'd just seen. A few nurses exchanged looks, confused, humbled, shaken. Elena simply stood there. For the first time in years, she felt her work settle in her chest, not like a burden, but like a purpose. She traced her fingers along the etched metal of the coin, letting the warmth sink into her skin. Then she ran her thumb over the seal of the envelope, anchoring herself in the reality of the moment. The morning sun spilled across the hospital entrance, casting a soft glow along the floor. She realized she was no longer trembling. Instead, a quiet steadiness grew inside her, a knowledge that her choices, her sacrifices, her long nights had mattered in ways she had never dared imagine. She walked toward the exit slowly, each step guided by a gentle certainty. There were no cheers, no applause, no spotlight following her. Just a tired nurse carrying a coin, an envelope, and the weight of gratitude from men who had seen more darkness than she ever would. But as she stepped outside, inhaling the crisp morning air, she knew something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, she didn't feel invisible. For the first time, she understood that even the quietest acts of courage can ripple across oceans. And for the first time, since the day she put on her scrubs, she felt like she had finally been seen.